All right. My next guest is someone I've had on the show before, but whose mission is combating wokeness within the Jewish community and building a community that stands up for itself and asserts its values. Please welcome Jared Stone. Jared, welcome back.
Thank you for having me, Jonathan. Good to be here.
So let's talk about what you've been doing the past few months because you have a new Substack and you've been doing a lot at Princeton University.
Yes. Let me start from the beginning. I'm happy to kind of go through the timeline and then we can get more into the weeds of things.
Sure, go ahead.
That's all right with you. Sure. Um, Basically, the story starts in January of last year. At the time, I was a second semester sophomore at Princeton. I was involved in Jewish life. I was on the precipice of being elected president of a few different organizations, one of which was Tigers for Israel, which is the premier pro-Israel student organization at Princeton. And um, before I'd even kind of launched myself into the position, before I had settled in, a BDS referendum came about on campus. This is a common story for a lot of Jewish students and pro-Israel students on college campuses today. BDS is no longer an isolated phenomenon. It's something that we see happen quite repeatedly, especially on elite college campuses like Princeton, which is where I go once again. And what that meant was that I was going to have to reorient pretty much my entire spring semester towards combating this BDS referendum as the president of the pro-Israel student organization, which by extension meant that I was going to be the de facto leader waging the battle against the referendum. So I spent the entire spring semester working against this. And without going into too much detail about kind of the intricacies of that process, which I talk about a lot in my Substack and in the articles that I publish for various publications, um, what it really taught me is that there's a great need for us to reinvigorate the type of leadership that is really lacking in the Jewish community today. What I saw with my own eyes is that the Jewish community, particularly the Hillel at my school, while very well intentioned, was really inept at combating this new strand of anti-Semitism that we're seeing come about on these college campuses. And what I've concluded from my own experience and from spending many, many months after the BDS campaign was defeated, going through my own sources, doing my own research, doing my own due diligence, was that this notion of wokeism, which has really come about in the past few years as kind of a talking point within the political ecosystem, I think really sits at the source of a lot of the issues that we're seeing as a Jewish community. And I think that it's important for us, especially speaking as a non-Orthodox Jew, to make sure that we're not indulging these behaviors, and that instead we first of all recognize that this is a likely culprit of this type of anti-Semitism that we're seeing manifest on college campuses today, and secondly that we're doing what is necessary to really take it head on and make sure that we're winning the battle.
Right. And I can tell you that I have members of my family that, particularly my father, who's on the adult education committee of his conservative synagogue, he has been a huge, like you, has been an opponent of this wokeism trend. In fact, the rabbi of that synagogue at one point put some stuff on the synagogue website that was quite woke, and there was actually a bit of an upcry and or uproar and
Mhm.
actually got taken down. So I
Mhm.
do agree that I have noticed this wokeism trend, within the non-Orthodox streams of Judaism. I would though challenge you though to draw a more direct line of how wokeism specifically harms our community.
Sure. So we have to kind of look into some basic political theory while also kind of understanding how these BDS campaigns and anti-Semitism itself manifests on college campuses, especially. And you can take this logic from college campuses and apply it to other institutions in American life as well, because I think that we're seeing precisely the same trends play out, not only on college campuses, but within major corporations, and among many members of the American government as a whole. And I think sort of the fundamental understanding behind why wokeism is to blame for a lot of this upsurge of anti-Semitism is because the philosophies that have guided the American Jewish community, especially non-Orthodox elements of the American Jewish community, are in many ways diametrically opposed to what wokeism is trying to impose upon society. I think the most simple way to look at it is that the American Jewish community has always profited from looking upward and from driving themselves from generally positions of poverty and positions of discrimination upward and upstream towards an atmosphere and an environment of success. We haven't been given the fairest lot by any means. We've suffered much persecution and discrimination, even in America, which has been the home of more opportunities for Jews than pretty much any other civilization in history. And yet, through all of those challenges, I think it's fair to say that we've made a real concerted effort to try to drive ourselves forward and to build and to innovate and to not assume this model of victimhood, or at least not to indulge it, to not kind of marinate in it, but to instead make sure that we're doing whatever is possible, even if it is difficult, to make sure that we are achieving the greatest success possible, and by extension, helping those around us. The term tikkun olam has been brought up in many, many instances by members of the non-Orthodox Jewish communities. I think it's kind of assumed a more progressive tinge these days. But I think the essence of tikkun olam is really making sure that by repairing the world, we're not only helping uplift ourselves, but we're helping to uplift those around us. And that has been really the guiding philosophy of, I think, the American Jewish community as a whole, particularly non-Orthodox Jewish communities. And I think in many ways, it explains why these communities as a whole lean more to the left. The left has always had a much more positive relationship with these Jewish communities, rooted in these core values. But I think when you look at this in comparison to wokeism, I think the main idea of wokeism is that it is this ideology that has permeated all these institutions of American life that is rooted upon the idea that every single major issue that comes about can be seen and conceived through a prism of oppression. Any issue that it is itself racism or is somehow tangibly connected to racism, or perhaps even not at all, must be viewed through a very narrow prism of oppression. And as a result, I think wokeism has encouraged these institutions, especially universities, to place much greater emphasis on victimhood, on trying to push people down for the inherent qualities that they bring to the table. And I think that really at its core, that is something that we're not used to as the Jewish people, because we are a very upward moving, upwardly mobile people. And I think it's bad not only for Jews, but it's also bad for American society as a whole, because America, through all its faults, through all its difficulties, has never succeeded when it is operated by that framework. And I think that wokeism
Oh,
our way of life as Americans.
okay. Just want to make sure you didn't cut out there. But
Sure.
I 100% agree, with that sentiment. I would even add, related to a subset of the whole woke ideology is the idea of intersectionality, which basically says that, based on who you are and where you come from, that determines, how much oppression that you experience. And very often it's used as an excuse to either say Jews are non-oppressed people, or only some Jews are, and it pits the Jewish community against each other effectively. And so
Correct.
that's why I've often rolled my eyes at stuff like this. And it's one of the reasons why I guess I'm a bit dismayed that in the past several years we've seen members of Congress from the Democratic Party, I've gone off about how, you have Republicans like Marjorie Taylor Greene and Paul Gosar, but you also have Democrats like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, Summer Lee, people who have been more than willing to either, vote against, America's relationship with Israel, and some of them even expressing outright anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. And I think, on this topic of kind of adding some more to the mix, I think one more thing that I would add to your point of intersectionality being a critical tenet of this, which it is, and this is kind of an uncomfortable thing for us to discuss, especially within the Jewish community, is that I think there's also an element of anti-white racism here. It's uncomfortable to discuss because, we have been pushed down by many different kind of extremist far-right white groups, especially in the mid-20th century, of course, in Europe. It's uncomfortable for us to talk about the fact that there is a real undercurrent of anti-white racism at play here. But I think that because we've been effectively cast, and Israel as a whole has effectively been cast as a white or a white adjacent society, there is a push to label us as white, or to at least apply the cultural context of us being white. upon our own existence and upon our situation, and especially upon Israel's existence in the Middle East. And I think that that fuels a lot of the hatred that we're seeing. And so I know it's uncomfortable historically for us to talk about that, but I really think it's very important to understand that that is an element that fuels this very toxic ideology.
Okay. Well, I do want to challenge that just a little bit. I would
Sure.
say that one thing that I've often done when I've talked with some of my more left-wing friends is that is that I argue that we need to present the Jewish people as the indigenous population of the land of Israel, not as a white
Right.
colonizing group, but as the indigenous population. And I find that centering it that way is actually helpful. I don't know if that's your experience.
Yes, that's an interesting, and I think that that brings us into the topic of kind of the prominent strategies that Jewish, especially veteran Jewish organizations use to combat this type of upsurge of anti-Semitism, the anti-Jewish, or excuse me, anti-Israel hatred. And what you bring up is, I think, one of the strategies that has been used or has been begun to be used quite a bit, which is the idea of framing this issue and trying to kind of rehash it so that we are able to comfortably fit within that progressive narrative. I agree with you 100% that it's important to emphasize that we are the indigenous people of this land. We are, right? And it's also important to note that most Israelis, by standard definitions, by conventional wisdom, are not white, right? Most Israelis are Mizrahi descent, which means that they are not white, they are not of European descent. And even for us who are Ashkenazi, there is plenty of genetic data to indicate that we are not related anymore to conventional white people in Europe, more so than we are related to Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews. And so that stuff is out there, and I absolutely agree with you. The problem with that, I think, is that we have spent so much time trying to frame the argument in those terms, and with good intentions behind that, right? It's important for us to try to innovate ways to make our narrative more heard and resonate with progressive audiences that have kind of been swayed away from us. But the problem with that is that some of these people who have been fueling this anti-Israel sentiment have found a way to completely bypass that, right? So a term that we hear a lot within Israel discourse and kind of Israel-related circles is this idea of pinkwashing, which, as you probably understand it, is it's this notion that yes, right, we are indigenous, perhaps, we've been here for a while. Most of us in Israel are not white. It's also true that, there are dynamics at play, and terrorism from the Palestinians and towards the Israelis is a real issue. And the fact that, gay rights and other progressive ideals are minimized and discriminated against in Palestinian society. But that does not exclude the fact, that does not excuse the fact that, what the Israelis are doing is supposedly apartheid or genocidal, right? So it is a complete circumvention of the logic behind that. And of course, you can't just dismiss that, right? You can't dismiss the actual reality of it. But this whole pinkwashing idea has been used to completely circumvent having any reasonable or rational discourse about this. And so I agree with you, Jonathan, right? Like, there are a million points to be made about how Israel is this bastion of democracy. It is the most progressive society in the Middle East by far, and the most tolerant society in the Middle East by far. But there are people who have still been able to bypass that in a lot of ways, which is a real challenge for us, right?
Right. And I also want to circle back and tie this into the idea of modern Israeli politics. I was recently at a Shabbaton back in November back in December with the Canadian Federation of Jewish Men's Clubs. It was a retreat. It was featured some of the men in Canada who are some of the most pro-Israel Jews you will find in Canada. And they were actually quite dismayed with the government that had just been elected, and they felt, possibly rightly so, that some of the reasons why that they'd support Israel might potentially go away under the new government. And so I'm wondering, though, if it is at all possible that the fact that there's a more right-wing government I think Israel has ever had, particularly with the presence of Ben Gvir in the government, that could potentially turn off people who are historically very pro-Israel.
Right. So that's a concern. And I think that that has made its way into a lot of the challenges that we face trying to communicate and be emissaries for the pro-Israel cause on the global stage. I have a few things to say about that. First of all, it's important to understand why we're here in the first place. And the reason why we're here is because leftism as a political force had been dominant in Israel for 50 years, right? Starting with the labor Zionist movement, the kibbutzim, David Ben Gurion. Labor Zionism was the predominant ideology until basically the 1970s when Begin and the Likud movement started to kind of find its way, kind of harkening back to the themes presented by Zev Jabotinsky and others like him. But obviously, what we see today is very different, and I think that a lot of that has to do with backlash from Israeli society towards kind of the lack of follow through there has been with these peace efforts that have been made, especially by the more left wing politicians like Yitzhak Rabin at the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, right? So, first of all, like I think that the rightward shift of Israeli society can be attributed to a lack of confidence and previous abilities by left wing governments to achieve peace. But as for the modern reality, it's difficult because I think it complicates the situation. But I also think in some ways it's a red herring. I think that it's the job of Jews and again, ambassadors of the pro-Israel cause around the world, particularly Jewish leaders in America and other prevailing democracies with large Jewish populations, to make it very clear that the internal affairs of Israel are not going to affect the broader pursuit of being pro-Israel and being Zionistic. And with this ideology, Zionism, there are many streams of it, right? So you're going to have times when Zionism manifests itself in Israel in ways that make some of us uncomfortable, but that's just the way it is. And I've been a little bit concerned by these prominent pro-Israel leaders, especially of veteran Jewish organizations in America and elsewhere, that have not really been able to draw the line between, disagreeing with the internal affairs of the government versus making sure that does not infect the broader Israel discourse. And I'll bring up a few. And some of these people I respect very much, but I don't think they've done a particularly good job at making that line very clear. There's a rabbi in New York City who has been a very prominent supporter of Israel and Zionism. He's a Reform rabbi named Amiel Hirsch. I'm a big fan of his. I think he does a great service to the Zionist cause and trying to infuse that with reform and other more secular forms of Judaism. But I think he was wrong to say that the Ben Gvirs and Smotriches of the world are going to make supporting Israel that much harder, right? Because I think that when you do that, you give license to those who are trying to use this new government to undermine the basic tenets of what it means to support Israel and to be a Zionist. I think it is so important to draw the distinction between the internal affairs of a country, like what we're seeing there, and the need to uphold its legitimacy and its sovereignty. And it's also important to understand that, within the broader global context, Israel has the right to engage democratically with some of these internal challenges. They pale in comparison to what we're seeing in a lot of these other countries, including India, which is the largest democracy in the world. There is easily a case to be made that, a lot of the governmental changes made by Narendra Modi and his party, the BJP, have done more to undermine the quote unquote democratic process than what's going on in Israel, but there hasn't been that much scrutiny that they faced. And so I think that one of the real worrying things for me is that, the anti-Zionists and these groups like JVP and If Not Now have been able to hitch themselves onto these efforts and to take advantage of them. I'll bring up one more anecdote before we move on to the next question. They had an anti-judicial reform rally in New York City in Washington Square Park recently. And it was meant to have a space for pro-Israel liberals, liberal Zionists in New York City to gather and to speak out against judicial reforms. Peter Beinart, who is a very notable anti-Zionist and is quite there on the scene in American Israel politics, he showed up at the rally and he had a speech. And it really confounded the whole situation because this guy, who's not a friend of Israel, uses this opportunity of judicial reform protesting as a stump speech to promote his own ideology. And I think that it's incumbent upon American Jewish leaders to make sure that they don't have those instances being corrupted by those who seek to ultimately undermine the state of Israel and to subvert it, not only Israeli democracy, but Israeli society as a whole. And so it's really, really important for us to use this moment to actually be more precise and more careful about how we're defining these things and all the more emphatic about our need to support Israel.
Right. And so my next question, I guess, more centers around a possible reason why maybe the community you're trying to build in America is still a work in progress, because
Yeah,
When I was one of the things that we were talking about a year ago was the definition of anti-Semitism proposed by IRA and
hmm
its proposed adoption by university campuses or cities or states across the world. And a number of professors in Canada actually signed a letter opposing this definition.
yeah.
But interestingly enough, there was a lack of representation among that signed letter among British professors. There was a not at all effort among the British Jewish professors to oppose this. And I actually wonder if one of the reasons for this is because the Jewish community of the UK spent several years living under the prospect of a Jeremy Corbyn premiership. And that prospect, I think, caused a sense of Jewish solidarity among the British Jewish public in a way that I think you're trying to build in the US. And I'm wondering, are we sadly going to need a shock like that to build the community you're trying to build?
Well, I hope that we don't have to have that happen, because I mean that was awful. And the Labor Party, I think, as is the case with the global leftist movement, has some real issues pertaining to anti-Semitism. I mean, even today, even with the ouster of Jeremy Corbyn and Keir Starmer, who himself is very pro-Israel and philo-Semitic, but you have members of the party, as you've seen even recently, right, who have made really troubling remarks. And so certainly I don't hope that I do not hope at all that that reality comes upon America's shores. But I do fear that that same model of anti-Semitism is making its way with great efficiency and great success into American institutions, right? So, America and the American Jewish way of life has been unique in that, throughout throughout the founding of the state of Israel, probably starting in the 60s, maybe the 70s, there's been a broad bipartisan consensus about needing to preserve and protect the American-Israel relationship, right? And downstream of that is the need to protect Jews and their ability to identify as such, as Zionists, as supporters of this relationship. But we are seeing that starting to be chipped away within the Democratic Party. And I'm often asked by people, because I've talked to a lot of people about my work and my own advocacy. I'm often asked by people, they say, oh, do you think the Republicans are kind of overextending their hand because they have become so strongly pro-Israel? And maybe as a result, there's been kind of a backlash within Democratic circles towards that. And to that, I say, it's not my responsibility, nor is it wise for us to tell Republicans to become less pro-Israel. But it is important for us to recognize that this kind of Corbynite model of anti-Semitism has made its way into these progressive circles in the Democratic Party. And to be honest, I do think it's going to become more of an issue within the Democratic Party. Just look at recent polling. There's a poll that came out very recently that indicated for the first time in decades, more Democrats identified as being pro-Palestinian than pro-Israel, right? And I mean, that is a huge, there's a seismic shift in the public discourse when you have a party that has completely changed, or whose base at least has completely changed their position on the issue. And so I do fear that, given the contours and the evolution of the left and of the Democratic Party in America, that issue is going to become more salient. And that's, I think, another thing that has motivated me to try to locate people who have been traditionally in those circles, conservative Jews, Reform Jews, and other secular Jews that have been predominated by these democratic or I hate to say liberal because they're illiberal, right? But these progressive or woke sensibilities. It's important for us to gather heterodox voices within those circles and to give them space and to give them an ability to actually advocate for their interests. Because the fact is, the Democratic Party is going in that direction by all conceivable measures, and it's important for us to put up a vanguard against that.
Right. The only thing that gives me even some sort of modicum of hope is, at least for now, the Biden administration is continuing policies from the Trump administration, moving the embassy to Jerusalem and recognizing the Golan Heights. He had an opportunity to roll those back, but he hasn't.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting. The fact is that the old guard of the Democratic Party, namely Biden and Pelosi and Hoyer, and I think that even Hakeem Jeffries, despite there being some little controversies with him, I think he kind of borrows his pro-Israel ideology from the old guard of the Democratic Party. There was never really concern of them being allied with Israel, but there's been some speculation, to be honest, among many Jewish conservatives, that Biden could be, in some ways, the last pro-Israel or ardently Zionist Democratic president that we see in America. And that's not exactly out of the picture at this point. And let's hope that that's not the case. But the fact is that the trend line is negative, and I think that we can all see it.
Right. And I guess just to end on an optimistic note there, my only hope is that if in 2028 Kamala is the nominee, I hope Doug Elmhoff can talk some sense into her on that.
Yeah, I think, listen, I do have issues with kind of the establishmentarian views of many leaders of the American Jewish community. But with that said, they're stalwart friends of the state of Israel. Maybe not in the exact same way as I am, but it's important for us to have those people in the fold. And so I do hope that Doug Emhoff and people like him remain paramount in democratic politics and have their voices continue to resonate and be heard all across the party.
Right. I told you about this when we were chatting in DMs, but just a bit of a
Mhm,
personal anecdote. And
mhm.
this actually, confirms something, not only the growing anti-Israel sentiment within the Democratic Party, but within, some within the left-wing Jewish community,
Yeah.
specifically. I went to Camp Ramah, which is a major conservative sleepaway camp in the US and
Mhm.
Canada. And my some of my counselors, if not now, did not exist at the time. But some of my counselors and Rosh Hashanah would go on to become members of If Not Now. And I think that
Yeah.
illustrates a failure of education and a failure of leadership to really push what at least I thought was conservative Judaism's core value of being pro-Israel.
Yeah. So I think that this brings us into kind of more of a discussion about these denominational issues that we're facing in the Jewish community as far as engaging with Israel. I think that there's been a real balkanization of how different Jewish communities have perceived Israel. And that follows along the same avenue that has caused Orthodox Jews to, I think, identify more with the political right. And in turn, for conservative reform and other secular Jews to tack on with the left and to move in a more steady leftward direction. And that's a real problem. The fact is that I think in many scenarios today, being pro Israel is being interpreted as unfashionable. Being anti Israel is seen as a kind of a cachet thing to be, especially at universities. And the fact is that there's a medley of social pressures that conservative Jews and Reform Jews and other non-Orthodox Jews are facing in terms of how to engage with their sense of Zionism. And the fact is, it is simply there's simply not an incentive structure that exists anymore that compels people like me and Reform Jews and other conservative Jews and other non-Orthodox Jews to be strongly pro-Israel. Because the fact is that given our predisposition, given our outlook on life and what we're trying to achieve and our vocational goals and our social goals, there's just really not a way for us to be able to exist within the current framework of society and be outspoken supporters of the state of Israel. And in turn, I think I would like to discuss a bit about another challenge that we face, which is the fact that, you know, the pro-Israel cause, I think, is becoming steadily more identified with Orthodox Judaism. Which, first of all, I think it's great that more Orthodox Jews are seeing themselves as pro-Israel, and certainly I support them in the political sense. We vote for the same people most of the time, but it's important that we don't identify that as simply a denominational tenet, right? It's important that we understand that being pro-Israel is something that unites all Jews and that implicates all Jews in the same way. And another concern of mine, and I recently published an article about this on my Substack, is that I think that in many ways, the pro-Israel discourse within the Jewish community is now becoming predominated by some of these Orthodox voices, and particularly by Orthodox voices that are not open to engaging with conservative Jews and Reform Jews and other secular Jews that are singing the same tune on the issue of Israel and of Judaism as a whole. And that's a real problem because the fact is that there are a lot of people actually in my situation, people like me, who are more politically skewing to the right, but more importantly, who are pro-Israel and also not orthodox. And it's important that we don't conflate those things and make it such that, to be a conservative Jew or a Reform Jew, one has to disavow their Zionism. And in turn, um, it's important for us to make sure that we become stakeholders in this cause and that we don't allow it to become associated simply with one branch of Judaism.
Right. And it's especially important because I think there's, I think many Orthodox Jews within the American Jewish community specifically are banking on the future of American Judaism, in which Orthodox Judaism becomes a greater share of the American Jewish community. And so maybe there's
Right.
that, that they're just banking on that fact. But I agree with you that it's important that every Jew, regardless of stream, sees themselves as having a stake in the future of the community and in the future of our homeland. I really do believe that.
Yeah, and I think you're totally right about I don't think that what they're saying about this increase in the Orthodox population is without merit. Like I think it's true, right? I mean, by pretty much every metric, what we're seeing is that the middle road of Judaism is being hollowed out, right? So more Jews who are identifying as politically conservative or more religious or more Zionist, they're moving along in an orthodox direction, right? There have been countless articles published online. There are various even major Jewish commentators who talk about this, about how either they're still kind of in the middle denominationally, they're conservative, they're reformed, they're secular, but they don't really identify, they don't really have a home, or they used to be, and because of their identification with their Judaism and with their Zionism, they have felt like they've had no other choice but to move in that Orthodox direction. And the fact is, let's be realistic here. There's still going to be a lot of Jews who don't quite feel at home within the Orthodox denomination, but who also want to identify very strongly with their Judaism and with their Zionism. They don't want to leave it all at the door, like some Jews are doing, who are moving in a more secular direction. And so it's very important for us to make sure that that tent is a big tent, that it covers that entire tract of land that we see, and that there are people in the middle. There might not be many of them, but they're important and they're part of the community and they're a part of Am Yisrael. We have to make sure that they're accounted for and that they have a home in some fashion. And so, I think that that's one of the motivations behind my Substack and behind my advocacy is the understanding that, just as I experienced at Princeton, there are a lot of people who feel like they're kind of in that very perilous situation where they're not Orthodox, but they very strongly identify with their Zionism and their Judaism, and it's more important than anything for them to feel a sense of connection and dedication to this cause, and they need to feel a sense of togetherness with other Jews who are like them.
We've spent a lot of time talking about what's happening right now in the Jewish community and all the challenges we face. But I do want to ask you on a more positive note, like what does the
Yeah.
future for your Substack look like? What is it that you're hoping to accomplish with the writing that you're doing? Any plans to branch out and talk about what's coming up?
Yeah, so it was a very organic effort, right? So I started my Substack late last year because I'd gone through this whole process and I was feeling very, very pessimistic about it. And I just wanted to find some way to channel this energy in an optimistic way. And so I started my Substack and I started to write and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote. I published 10 articles so far. I published for the Jerusalem Post about, my feelings about all of this stuff. I published for the Jewish Journal. I wrote a whole article about, the quote unquote new Jew, which is not my term, by the way, but I borrowed it from somebody else who I think feels similarly and who's on the national scene. As far as my Substack, my hope is to just let things grow organically. I've been reached out to by many, many people, who've looked at my writings and my articles and my advocacy on Twitter or elsewhere on the internet, who have really resonated with it and who have felt like it's touched them in a way that, other organizations or other causes have not, in the sense that it's helped them to understand that they're not alone in this struggle that they're facing. And my hope is that, more than anything else, my Substack can become and remain for these people a home and a place where they can identify with other people and where they can really feel like they have somebody looking out for their best interests. And so as far as like the actual tangible future, I'm hoping to write more articles. My idea is that I love to have more people writing articles for my Substack who kind of understand those themes and who fit within that ecosystem. I want to continue to do podcasts. This podcast has been wonderful. I'm doing a podcast next week with another organization, which is going to be great. And really, my only goal is to get the word out there because it's important that people feel like they're not alone. That's the one thing that we've seen, I think really stunt our growth and stunt our ability to foster change. And that has been people feeling alone and isolated And that's the last thing I want for people, because I understand how it feels to be in that situation. I don't want that for other people. And I just want them to feel like they have a place where they can call home, where they can identify with others. And the rest of it, the rest of it is up to chance, right? So we'll see what happens. I'm really looking forward to it, and I just wanted to grow, and I want more people to identify with this movement.
Right. Jared, thanks so much for coming on. This is the part of the show where you get to plug in everything you want to plug in. Where do
Sure.
people
So
follow you?
Sure. So my Twitter is at JStonePolitics. Um, I've been tweeting there for a while, and now I think my content has kind of shifted away from the nitty-gritty political analysis and election forecasting towards this more Jewish Israel-oriented content. So feel free to follow me there. My Substack is called Kavod. So if you look up Kavod Jared Stone, you'll be sure to find it. Um, if you just look up on the internet, Jared Stone, one word, .substack.com, you'll also be able to find it. Please, read through the articles, share your thoughts with me. I love to hear from people. It's been a real pleasure to meet new people through mutual interests, and to just find real positive avenues for change. And I really hope that you're interested in pursuing this and looking this up. And, I hope to keep in touch with any of you who are interested in following up with this.
Anyone watching who wants to write for them, feel free to reach out. And
Absolutely.
I really hope you guys are able to build a community and an organization that's able to advocate all of these things, because it's a really important cause. Thanks, Jared.
Thank you. Really appreciate it, Jonathan.